Could be. Okay, so last chapter, woo, we have made it to the end. Chapter 22, Basic Investment Math. I will tell you, I use very little out of the book and very little off of the slides for this chapter, because there's not a ton in this chapter you need to know that's not math. It's basically math. There are very few concepts in this chapter you need to know about. It's a math chapter. Lucky for you, it's math you've already seen, it's just relabeled math. If you know this T-bar, the profit and loss T-bar, you can do everything in chapter 22. Because it'll ask you for something like rate of return on equity. And that sounds like something you have no idea how to do. But yeah, you do. What's equity? Money you put in at when you buy, right? So it's your down payment when you buy, right? There you go. And any other time, it's the difference between what you owe and what the property's worth, right? Equity is always the difference between what you owe on the property and what it's worth. All right? Has everybody got that? Equity. Write that definition down. Equity. The difference between what I owe and what the property's worth. And if you didn't write it down, we're recording it anyway, so you can rewatch it. The difference between what I owe and what the property's worth. So if they ask you something like, what's your rate of return on equity? What they're asking you is, what's your rate of profit on your investment? Because if I'm taking out a loan, my investment's not the purchase price, right? My investment's my what? My down payment. In other words for that is equity. Isn't my equity when I buy what I make my down payment? Does that make sense for everybody? And so when they ask for a rate of return on equity, what they're asking is, what's my percent profit based on my equity investment? You see how it's the same thing? It's just relabeled. It works the exact same way. Let me give you an example of what I mean. All right, I have Travis purchases a home for a purchase, or an investment property, an investment home, for a purchase price of $150,000 with an 80% LTV loan. The property rents for $1,200 a month with yearly property taxes of $3,000 and insurance of $600. I'll give you a second to write that down. Travis has purchased the property with a purchase price of $150,000. That has and he's got an 80% loan to value loan. The property rents for $1,200 a month with yearly property taxes of $3,000 and insurance of $600. Now, the question might say, what is his rate of return? Or it could say rate of return on equity. They both mean the same thing. What is his rate of return? Rate of return sounds like which one of those things in that T-bar? Rate of profit or loss, right? So this is what they're asking us for. Rate of profit or loss. The T-bar tells me I need to divide my dollar profit or loss by my original investment, right? So let's figure those out. my profit. And when I'm talking about a rate of return, I'm talking about an annual rate of return. How would I figure out my profit on that property annually?
1,200 times 12.
1,200 times 12, my monthly rent times 12, right? So 1,200 times 12 is what?
14,400.
14,400 a year in rent, right?
Subtract that then. Taxes.
Subtract out the taxes and insurance, otherwise known as my operating expenses, right? Subtract out my operating expenses of $3,600 a year, and what am I left with for a profit on that property? 10,800. In another chapter, what's another word for that, or phrase for that number down there? Rent minus expenses. Not cash flow, net operating income. That's the net operating income from that property, right? Everybody follow that? We haven't gotten to cash flow yet. We'll get there in this chapter. We're coming. But isn't that my profit? Isn't that my dollar profit on that property? It goes up here. Now what do I need to know? What are the numbers? I need to know my original investment, right? Or my original equity. Well, to figure that out, I got to figure out how much of this 150 was loan and how much was my investment, right? So, how much of that was my investment? $30,000. Does everybody see where that number comes from? Because if you do an 80% loan to value loan, you get 120. The difference is my down payment, which is 30. So my original investment is $30,000. Can we calculate our rate of return on equity now? Something so fancy sounding?
Yep.
$10,800 divided by $30,000. Calculate the rate. So what do you do at the end? Multiply by 100. That's a 36% return. Annually. That's pretty damn good, isn't it? Does that make sense? 36% annually is my rate of return on equity. Has everybody got that? All right. Can I erase this? Now, let's talk about comparing whether you should borrow money or shouldn't borrow money. There's a word for that. It's called leverage. Leverage is the power of borrowing. And sometimes it makes sense to borrow money. And sometimes it does not make sense to borrow money. And you need to be able to do the math to figure out whether you should borrow money or shouldn't borrow money. Okay? So we're going to use that same property again. We're purchasing this same property for $150,000. Cash. What did we say our yearly profit was on that?
1080 or
10,800. Same example as before. $10,800 profit, right? Or net operating income. What's our original investment if we pay $150,000 cash? $150,000. Give me a rate of return. $7.2%. Well, it looks like a slam dunk to borrow money, right? We left out an important part of the borrowing money in that first example. We gotta pay interest on that money we borrowed, right? It's gonna eat into that little profit number on the top, okay? So, let's go back to the same example again now, right? $150,000 purchase, but this time, $150,000 with our 80% LTV loan. And that loan is at 9% interest. So, how much was our net operating income on this property after we paid our operating expenses? $10,800. NOI. I own the property. All I care about is NOI, right? I mean, I don't care about how much money's actually left in my pocket after I pay things like the mortgage, right? Or do I care more about the cash flow?
That minus $13,500.
That minus, how much interest?
$13,500.
Really?
Which you get.
Would just be nice and assume it's an interest-only loan. So, what's our cash flow on this property?
I do 13.
I know, I'm just writing the number down. 120,000 times 9%, I'm assuming is what you're doing, right?
I got 1080. 1080. Yeah, I didn't get 13.
Oh, it's how much?
1080. $10,080.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, let's do
500.
8% interest, how about it?
I'm
Alright,
gonna do it from the 120.
It's still
That's the
one.
loan.
Yeah, 10,800 for the.
let's do 8%, I don't want to be exactly equal.
$9,600.
$9,600? Because it's the 120, we're not paying interest on the whole 150. It's Dustin's fault.
Not bad.
So now, what are we left with here, our profit? $1,200, right? At the end of the year, $1,200. We also call this what? Cash flow. Now, T-bar time. Profit's $1,200. What's my original investment though?
30.
30,000. Give me a rate of return. How much? 4%. So, for this particular property, would we be better off paying cash or better off taking out that loan? Paying cash. We're gonna get a better return on our money if that's the loan that's available to us. Does everybody see how you make this comparison, right? In this particular property, we'd be better off paying cash for the property because paying cash is gonna get us a 7% return on our money instead of a 4% return on our money. That makes sense, right? That's the kind of comparison. Now there's terminology that goes with this, and it's pretty easy to understand. Leverage is the advantage you gain by borrowing money. Positive leverage means it's smart to borrow money. Negative leverage means you're better off paying cash. So is this an example of positive leverage or negative leverage? This would be negative leverage. This would be negative leverage. Let me show you how a little adjustment would make here. Let's say instead of at this ridiculous 8%, we get a more reasonable 5% interest rate. I think that's right. Let's check on that. 5% would be $6,000 on 120.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, 6,000.
So now my cash flow is $5,800 on that property. My investment stays the same, still $30,000. What's my new rate of return?
19.2.
19? Positive leverage or negative leverage? Extremely positive. Not only am I getting a 19% return, but I can conceivably multiply that times 5 properties now. Because presumably, if I'm making this comparison, I have $150,000 in cash, right? And I'm only investing 30 over here. So now I can invest in stuff, because I wouldn't want to invest just my 30 and make 19%. I'd want to invest the whole 150 and make 19%. So I'm going to go buy 5 properties and get 5 of those loans. Donald Trump, right? Borrow every dollar you can get and then some. But clearly it illustrates the difference between positive leverage and negative leverage.
So that's 95% gain. If you add up that 19% times, you said 5 times?
Well, it would be 19% on the 150.
On the 150, right?
Right.
Which is at the end is what you're getting.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
you're maybe double.
Yeah, a lot of money, lot more money that way.
If you were to figure that by the 5, then on the T-bar, you make the 30, the 150. And then would you take the 580 and times that by 5 to figure out the rate of return on 5 properties? Or if you're gonna use the 150 cash
If you were just gonna, if you
on
were
5
just,
properties?
well now, no, if you just wanted to figure out how much money you would make, is that what you're asking?
Whether, if you figure out how much the rate of return would be.
Well, the rate of return would stay the same. If you get 5 properties that would all produce that same income,
Okay, then it would just always be 19%, it's just it.
it'd just be 90% of a bigger number.
Right.
Yeah. Everybody got that? That's how you compare with investment math. Okay? Now, I'm gonna show you how to do one more thing called a rate of increase in equity. This is rate of return on equity. We want to talk about a rate of increase in equity. So, rate of increase in equity. Use the same exact T-bar. Same exact T-bar.
So this one is telling us how long it would take.
This is telling us how fast my equity is growing. How fast my investment is growing. Not how much money I'm making on a yearly basis, but how fast my investment is growing in that property.
Cause that's how with the, not the cost, but the income approach,
Mhm.
then that one, we're trying to figure out how fast we would get our money back.
That's right, how fast we're capturing our money back.
But this is how much we're investing in it. They're
How much we're
totally
growing our investment, yes. How fast our investment in that property is growing. Because remember, equity, so we're talking about rate of increase or rate of change in equity. We're talking about how fast is the difference between what I owe and what it's worth growing. Because that's what equity is, right? How fast is that gap growing? So, Travis purchases property in 2000, let's say 2008. What?
So this could be a loss.
We're not gonna make it loss, we're gonna make it for $125,000 with a 90% LTV loan. and sells 4 years later for $160,000 with a loan payoff of $110,000. And I want to know what's my rate of increase in equity. Remember, equity is the difference between what I owe and what it's worth. If I'm talking about a rate of increase in equity, that dollar profit or loss that goes on the top of the T-bar is going to be how much my equity increased or decreased. Does everybody see that? So to find how much my equity increased or decreased, I need to find out how much equity I had in the beginning and how much equity I had in the end. Everybody with me so far? So, beginning equity. What did I pay for the property? 25. How much of that 125 was my money? 12,500. 10% of it, right? Okay. So when I bought, my original equity, I'll just put OE, 12,500. Everybody with me?
Yep.
Now, how about my final equity? Remember, equity is always the difference between what it's worth and what I owe, right? How much is it worth when I sold it? 160. Was that my final equity? No. Because I got a loan I got to pay off, right? So what am I going to do with that loan? Subtract the 110. So my final equity equals how much? $50,000. So does everybody see that my equity in the 4 years I've owned this property has gone from 12,500 up to $50,000? Does that make sense? So if I'm trying to calculate the increase or decrease in equity, don't I need to figure out how many dollars the equity increased or decreased? Isn't that what goes on top of the T-bar? Dollar profit or loss? So what's my dollar profit in equity there? 50,000 minus 12,500. 37,000. So my increase in equity is 37,500. What goes on the bottom to calculate a rate of return, or a rate of increase, or a rate of anything? Original investment. My original investment was 12,500. We don't care about the loan part because we're just talking about our investment. So give me my rate of return. 300%. My rate of increase in equity is 300%. Because here's what happened. Here's what happened to my pocket. I pulled $12,500 out of my pocket in 2008 and put back into my pocket in 2012 $37,500. I tripled my money. That's called a rate of increase in equity. And that's actually my profit on the property. That's my true rate of profit on the property. Does that make sense? Cause it's how much money I made. The loan just washed itself out.
That's assuming you don't take any capital improvements or.
That's assuming you haven't spent any money on the property, right? You could, of course, that could be much more complex.
And if you lived in that house, you wouldn't have to pay capital gains tax on that.
Right, if you lived in it, you wouldn't pay capital
But
gains tax.
if you didn't live in it,
You pay capital gains tax on that.
50%.
Everybody okay with that?
Yeah.
That's chapter 22. I mean, honestly. But it all goes back to that same profit and loss T-bar. It's just a matter of renaming the things to make them fit the T-bar. It stays the same every single time. Any question about that? Alright, so you got plenty of math homework. I gotta give you a HUD statement. Don't run away. And I will see you on Monday. For Monday,